When you think of Indonesia, you probably picture tropical islands, beautiful beaches, ancient temples, and rice terraces. And while all of that is true, there's a side to this picture that most people don't see. Indonesia is home to one of the world's most polluted rivers. Pollution is a global challenge today, but the Citarum River is among the most extreme cases. The river is choked with toxic chemicals, heavy metals, untreated sewage, and loads of trash. Journalists who have visited the Citarum describe a horrific scene with massive heaps of trash floating on the water, so much so that people could walk on it without sinking. In some areas, the water was barely visible. It was completely covered with trash. When you did see it, one journalist said it looked black and sludgy like dirty motor oil and was bubbling in some places like a witch's brew. Back in 2018, the Indonesian government launched an ambitious project to make the Citarum River drinkable by 2025. Now, as 2025 starts to draw to a close, you might be wondering, well, what's the state of the Citarum today? Perhaps, even more importantly, how did this once pristine river become a toxic sludge? The Citarum is the longest river in West Java. Nearly 30 million people depend on the river in one way or another. For some, it's the source of their electricity. 3 hydroelectric dams on the Citarum provide electricity to millions in Bandung and the areas around Jakarta. These dams double as reservoirs, supplying water to irrigate about 400,000 hectares of rice fields. That's about 5% of the rice farms in the country, by the way. Beyond irrigation and power, the Citarum is primarily a source of drinking water for major cities in West Java. Up to 80% of the water supply for Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, comes from this river. For millions of people in communities along the Citarum, the river is the source of the water that they use to bathe, cook, wash their clothes, and perform all their household tasks. People have also fished in the Citarum for hundreds of years, relying on it for their food and livelihood. In more modern times, thousands of factories have sprung up along its banks and in its basin. According to some estimates, the river supports up to 20% of Indonesia's industrial output. Now, given the central role the Citarum plays in the lives of the people of West Java, you might imagine that it's really well protected. But it's not. Since the 80s, the river has slowly become a toxic mess. Today, the water quality is absolutely terrible for most of its length. If you follow the 290-kilometer course of the Citarum from its source at the foothills of Mount Wayang, you'd find mountains of floating garbage at different sections of the water. There's every type of trash you can think of here: bloated bodies of dead fish and other animals, tree branches, styrofoam, cans, plastic bags, bottles, books, toiletries, clothing, pieces of fruit and vegetables, furniture, cooking utensils, and just about everything else. Deep breath. There is even more garbage strewn along the riverbanks as well, because why not? But this visible pollution is only a fraction of the problem. In 2013, the Asian Development Bank released a report warning that the water quality of the Citarum is well outside safe limits. At the time, tests showed that the river had about 5,000 times the allowed limit of fecal coliform bacteria. It also had more than 9 times the biological oxygen demand, meaning there is very little oxygen for fish and other aquatic life. In 2013, the Blacksmith Institute conducted further tests on the Citarum and found that it contains contaminants from both industrial and domestic sources. According to the Blacksmith Institute, lead levels in the water exceeded the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency standards by 1,000 times. Holy shit. This is bad. The river was also found to contain high concentrations of aluminium, manganese, and iron, all well above globally acceptable levels. Greenpeace tested the waters of the Citarum in 2012 too and found heavy metals like chromium, mercury, zinc, antimony, and copper, as well as toxic chemicals like arsenic, sulfates, and nonylphenol. That's tricky. All these contaminants are incredibly harmful to humans and animals, especially in the high levels they're found in the Citarum. And it's worth noting here that the river has not once met Indonesia's water quality standards since those standards were established in 1989. If you need more signs that the Citarum River is extremely polluted, well, the water also smells really terrible. An article by The Guardian published in 2020 says, quoting here, "The smell is the first thing that hits you on the banks of the Citarum River in West Java, Indonesia. The odor is dense, rubbish rotting in the hot sun, mixed with an acrid tone of chemical waste." In addition to this foul-smelling odor, the waters of the Citarum are almost always discolored and sometimes even kind of foamy. Ibu Entin, a woman who has lived along the river's banks since the 70s, told Al Jazeera that she has seen the water change color due to pollution, turning from green to black, yellow, and brown. Quoting her, "When it turned white, it smelled especially bad." Despite the horrendous state of the Citarum River, people still use it. Many have little to no alternatives to meet their daily needs. An estimated 15 million people rely on this polluted river. Several cities in West Java struggle with water shortages. However, residents of impoverished settlements along the banks of the Citarum are particularly vulnerable. There are virtually no pipelines to deliver clean water to these communities. Generally, the best way to get water in many parts of West Java is to rely on groundwater. But if you're living near the Citarum, you need to dig up to 150 meters down before you'll find some uncontaminated water. 150 meters. Mostly, only factories near the river have the capacity to dig to such depths and purify the water they find. So, in some riverside communities, locals depend on the generosity of nearby factories for water. In most communities, however, people buy clean water or rely on neighbors with wells. To save money, some only buy drinking water and use the Citarum for everything else like bathing, washing clothes, and cooking. Ibu Entin told Al Jazeera that she and her family use water from the Citarum to brush their teeth, shower, and clean their dishes. But fortunately, they get their drinking water from a neighbor's well. And I guess that's why they're still alive? The river turned white. But believe it or not, they're some of the lucky ones. For many, drinking contaminated water from the Citarum is their only option. Abe Salafulo, a resident of one of the numerous communities near the river, told Sonda International that people usually fetch water from the Citarum and let it sit for a few days to allow the sediments to separate. Then they filter it and boil it before drinking. But this does little, if anything, to remove the heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and other hazardous pollutants from the water. In Jakarta, where water from the Citarum is filtered at treatment plants before being pumped through the city's pipelines, it is still considered, quoting here, not safe at all. Sumengsen Sutomo, a water quality expert and researcher at the University of Indonesia, says the government needs to invest more in purifying water, quoting him. They continue to build infrastructure, but they completely ignore the issue of the drinking water, end quote. Because they lack access to clean water, many people in West Java only drink bottled water, especially in cities like Jakarta. Every year, millions of liters of bottled water are consumed in the province, and a large percentage of these bottles end up in the Citarum, further polluting the river, because of course they do. Today, most people take it for granted that the Citarum is highly polluted. At least 2 generations of Indonesians have never seen this river clean. But the Citarum hasn't always been like this. For tens of thousands of years, Javanese people have lived by the Citarum and treasured the water. Ancient civilizations flourished along the river, including the 4th century Tamanagara kingdom. People drank the water, they fished from the water, they used it to irrigate their rice fields. They taught their children to swim in it. But now it's a completely different story. Residents of cities like Bandung count themselves fortunate if they don't have anything to do with the Citarum. So what happened to this river? Well, it started out in the 70s and 80s. International textile manufacturers were battling increased environmental regulations and rising labor costs in Western countries. So, what do? They outsourced their manufacturing to factories abroad. And Indonesia, with its rich history of fabric production, emerged as an ideal destination. Factories started springing up along the banks of the Citarum, and it soon became the center of Indonesia's textile industry. These companies chose to set up near the river because it had abundant groundwater and they could easily dispose of wastewater into the Citarum. Over time, this area became known as Dollar City, and factories were supplying renowned brands such as Wrangler, Gap, Calvin Klein, Yves Saint Laurent, The North Face, and others. The growth of Indonesia's textile industry had a positive effect on the country's economy, creating jobs and driving West Java's urbanization. People from all over the country migrated to the province to work in these factories. At the time, the Citarum was still clean and teeming with fish. Dedi Rahmat is one of the people who moved to Bandung in the early 70s to work in a textile factory. In an article published by the Pulitzer Center, he told journalist Debbie Price that the river, quote, ran clean and clear in those days. But as more factories sprang up along the banks of the Citarum, the water became increasingly polluted. These factories were dumping dyes, heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and microplastics into the water daily. On days when the dye is heavy, water in the rice paddies turns black or navy blue. By most estimates, there are about 2,700 factories around the river today, and most of them manufacture textile and pharmaceutical products. Only a few of these facilities have proper waste management systems. Most of them have been dumping untreated waste into the Citarum for decades. Some have even gone so far as to build pipelines to convey wastewater from their facilities directly into the river. In 2018, the Indonesian government conducted an investigation and found that up to 340,000 tons of hazardous wastewater and 20,000 tons of solid waste were pumped into the river daily. While factories have contributed immensely to the pollution of the Citarum, they're not the only culprits. The influx of people from across Indonesia to work in Dollar City led to rapid population growth in the area. However, the infrastructure to support this large population was, and still is, inadequate. For starters, there is no proper waste management or public sewage system in Dollar City and many parts of West Java. Up to 70% of communities along the Citarum's banks lack proper waste management and sanitation services. As a result, tons of household waste, including single-use plastics and untreated sewage, just end up in the Citarum. Some people living near the river burn their trash. Most just throw it out, and it usually just ends up on the banks of the river, forming these giant piles that someone eventually burns. But many of the garbage just goes into the river. According to Mongabe, a third of the waste generated by people living along the Citarum ends up in the river. There are even anecdotal reports of septic tanks being flushed directly into it. Even the trash from people living far away from the Citarum often ends up there. Indonesia has some of the highest annual rainfall in the world, leading to heavy flooding. These floods sweep up garbage from various cities in West Java and carry it into the Citarum and other rivers in the province. In Jakarta, where there's a waste collection system, most landfills have exceeded their capacity, so a lot of trash ends up at illegal dumping sites, where floods then sweep it into the river. All roads lead to the Citarum. The rain also washes fertilizers and pesticides from farms, and they go into the river, which of course adds to the pollution even more. The combination of toxic chemicals and heavy metals from factories, solid waste and sewage from households, and runoff from farms has caused almost irreparable damage to the Citarum. Dedi Rama told Price that he feels some guilt for the state of the river, having worked in textile mills for years and watched the Citarum grow dark and dirty. Environmental groups like Greenpeace and activists in West Java have been calling for immediate action to save the Citarum for decades, advocating revisions to Indonesia's lax pollution laws. For years, the Indonesian government allowed factories to discharge untreated wastewater into the river, provided it didn't contain certain dangerous chemicals. But activists argued that the government's list of outlawed chemicals was just too narrow. Ahmad Ashov, a campaigner for Greenpeace Southeast Asia, told Al Jazeera that the Indonesian government only regulates 264 of the 100,000 chemicals used in the textile industry. And, according to him, 1,500 chemicals are added to that list every year. Activists also claim textile factories are bribing inspectors to escape the consequences of pumping banned chemicals into the Citarum. Ahmad said that this was an open secret. To date, only a handful of companies have ever been sanctioned for contaminating the river, although the culprits are definitely many, allegedly. In 2013, Greenpeace said it tested wastewater flowing into the Citarum from a factory operated by one of Indonesia's leading textile manufacturers and found that it had a pH of 14, that's alkaline enough to burn your skin. They also found several toxic chemicals and heavy metals in the wastewater. Ahmed told Al Jazeera that he got burned while performing tests on the wastewater. During the tests, I got a couple of tiny splashes on my face. It hurt, and then it was itchy for about a week, end quote. In 2016, Greenpeace and other environmental groups sued the Indonesian Ministry of Environment for allowing 3 of the country's largest textile manufacturers to pollute the Citarum River. The court sided with Greenpeace, ordering the licenses that allowed the big 3 textile companies to discharge wastewater into the Citarum be revoked. But this was only the first step in a long journey. These 3 companies contribute only a fraction of the total pollution entering the Citarum. The Indonesian government, for its part, blames the pollution of the Citarum mainly on communities along the river who dump their garbage into the water. However, critics say that this is a way to deflect blame for the problem. As one of the main pillars of Indonesia's economy, the textile industry wields political sway. The factories along the Citarum manufacture clothing for some of the world's top brands. In its campaign to save the river, Greenpeace shamed clothing brands like Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic, and Puma for their complicity in polluting the river. To be clear, people living near the river are not happy about its pollution, but many have become desensitized to the filthy water, and most view cleaning the Citarum as just this insurmountable task. Community leaders say people have been threatened for speaking out against textile companies for polluting the river. A leader of the Elengen community group told Al Jazeera that he had to move to another area and frequently change his phone number to escape threats. Greenpeace claims the pollution of the Citarum has cost Indonesia about $866 million in losses over 2 decades. But more importantly, it's having an adverse effect on the health, food security, livelihoods, and well-being of millions of people in West Java. The river used to be one of the main sources of freshwater for the people of the province. Now, it's not even safe for livestock or farmlands. As a result, many people depend on groundwater, but factories on the banks of the Citarum have over-extracted groundwater, and toxic chemicals in the river have penetrated deep into underground wells. So those wells aren't even completely safe either. The polluted waters of the Citarum have also contaminated thousands of acres of rice fields, making them just unfit for human consumption. Still, people eat this rice. They feed it to their animals, ingesting the toxic chemicals and heavy metals from the river. Farmers living near the Citarum who don't want to use water from the river to irrigate their fields have very few alternatives. Some farmers have been forced to sell their farmland at cheaper prices due to this. Fishermen have also been immensely affected by the pollution in the Citarum. The river used to have a wide variety of fish species, including common carp, walking catfish, suckermouth catfish, and minnows. However, since 2008, the number of fish species in the Citarum has dropped by about 60%. The fish species that are somehow able to survive in this toxic river are contaminated with heavy metals and microplastics. In 2019, Indonesian researchers found that fish and mussels from Jakarta Bay contain mercury and other toxic compounds. Quote, people who consume fish from Jakarta Bay are susceptible to cancer and degenerative diseases like kidney failure. That was a quote from Etuyani, a professor at Bogor Agricultural University. Despite the horrid state of the Citarum and the fact that fish from the river are simply unsafe to eat, fishermen still cast their nets and still sell what they catch. According to The Guardian, these fish end up on tables across West Java, from communities on the banks of the Citarum to as far as the city of Jakarta. The fishermen angling for a catch in the contaminated Citarum have no choice. For many, fishing is their main source of livelihood, but pollution in the river has made it harder for them to earn a living. Kaswara, a fisherman from a riverside community near Bandung, told Monga Bay that he sometimes returns home empty-handed. Quote, the average fish catch can be up to 5 kilograms a day. At the time that article was published in 2022, this translated to earning about $5 daily. To supplement their income, many fishermen now raid the floating islands of garbage on the Citarum to scavenge for plastic bottles and aluminium cans, which they can sell for meager amounts. Perhaps the most alarming aspect of the pollution of the Citarum is the effect that it's having on the health of the people living by the river. In these communities, skin conditions like dermatitis, rashes, and scabies are very common, especially among people who venture into the river. Like many in her community, Ibu Entin and her relatives struggle with skin irritation as a result of using the Citarum, quoting her, I have a reddish mark on my skin, all over my body feels itchy, and I struggle to sleep at night. It's the same for my family. All of the people who live here have skin problems from top to bottom. Now, if the water changes color quickly, the itching gets worse. I'm angry, but I don't know who to get angry at. We talked to the community leaders, and they went to the factories already, but they don't respond. The only thing that matters to them is to keep the business running, not the villagers' lives. End quote. Skin irritation is one of the milder health problems caused by the Citarum's polluted waters. Many people suffer from more severe conditions like bronchitis and respiratory issues, as well as diarrhea, stomach aches, intestinal problems, renal failure, and tumors. There also have been outbreaks of cholera in the area. Even more alarmingly, there have been reports of stunted growth or developmental delays in children born in these communities. Indonesia's Coordinating Minister for Maritime Affairs, Luhut Panjaitan, said, the people who drink the polluted water will not be productive and can only pursue their studies until high school at most because their intelligence declines. According to the United Nations, women and children are disproportionately affected by the harmful pollutants in the Citarum. Since women usually perform household chores such as cooking and cleaning, they're exposed to contaminated water for prolonged periods. Pregnant and nursing women are also at high risk. Now, at this point, you may be wondering why Indonesian authorities don't just clean this shit up. Well, it's just not as straightforward as it might seem. There are a lot of factors contributing to the pollution of the water, which must all be addressed for any cleanup program to be successful. Successive governments have attempted to clean the Citarum, but with little success. In February 2018, Indonesia's president at the time, Joko Widodo, unveiled what is arguably the most comprehensive cleanup plan to bring the river back to life. The goal of the project, dubbed Citarum Harum, or Fragrant Citarum, was to make the river drinkable by 2025. President Widodo deployed about 7,000 military personnel to clean the Citarum. The soldiers were divided into 22 groups, each responsible for a section of the river. They were authorized to block any factory outlets discharging wastewater into the Citarum. The ambitious 7-year cleaning plan involved removing solid waste from the river, building waste treatment facilities, and conducting various environmental education projects. The government also launched a reforestation drive to plant trees upstream at the source of the Citarum and at critical points along its banks to reduce runoff from farms and soil erosion. Additionally, a task force was set up to monitor and report on the water quality. There were also plans to introduce fish species back into the river to restore the ecosystem. While the Fragrant Citarum project addresses many aspects of the problem, critics say that it doesn't do enough to tackle pollution at its source. And that's, of course, the factories along the river. Some Indonesian officials had proposed filing a civil lawsuit against key polluters, but nothing ever came of it. Similarly, a proposal to relocate the factories on the Citarum Basin to elsewhere just didn't see the light of day. Indonesia has been hard at work on the cleanup project since 2018. Various NGOs and community groups have stepped up to support the project, building waste processing facilities and educating people about the dangers of dumping waste into the river. Meanwhile, the former mayor of Bandung, Ridwan Kamil, has since banned styrofoam packaging in the city. If you recall, styrofoam is among the solid waste that's found in the river. Ridwan admitted the shortcomings of the Indonesian government and its failure to save the Citarum, but says there's more commitment to the cause now. Quoting him, "In the early days, the political will to improve environmental conditions was, in the end, eroded by political bargaining, especially among leaders who focused on economic growth and ignored sustainability." End quote. If successful, the cleaning of the Citarum would go a long way toward addressing water shortages in West Java and supporting the cultivation of over 60,000 acres of rice farms, according to The Guardian. In 2022, about 5 years after the launch of the Fragrant Citarum project, there was already some noticeable improvement in the state of the river. People can go fishing in the river now, and children go swimming too, especially when it rains. There was a resident speaking to a reporter. Ridwan told Mongo Bay that the water quality will continue to improve as officials enforce waste standards. Quoting, "In addition, we are implementing communal livestock waste management, as well as tackling the behavior among people who often throw garbage and household waste directly into river bodies." End quote. We're now counting down the days until the end of 2025. So, to answer the question about whether the Citarum is drinkable, the answer is no. Not yet, at least. While the Indonesian government will have you believe that the state of the Citarum has continued to improve since the Fragrant Citarum project was launched in 2018, the people on the ground tell a different story. Yes, the water quality of the river is generally better thanks to new sewage treatment plants, but factories continue to discharge toxic waste into the river. They just conceal the pipes that take their wastewater to the Citarum. And if they're caught, they can just easily bribe their way out of trouble. Despite the best efforts of the military and volunteers working to remove solid waste from the Citarum, you will still find a lot of trash in the river today. When it rains, the floods take vast amounts of plastic and other garbage back into the river, sort of like the cleanup never happened. An article in the South China Morning Post earlier this year read, "Just last year, photos and videos of the Citarum went viral, showing officials on small boats trying to clean up a huge patch of rubbish, estimated to stretch 3 kilometers and weighing some 100 tons. One reason this trash problem persists is that people continue to depend on bottled water, resulting in heaps of plastic waste every day. Also, aside from strategically placed signage, there's no proper mechanism to enforce the ban on dumping household waste into the Citarum, and the communities near the river still don't have an effective trash collection system. And it gets worse, because Indonesia is receiving waste from other countries. According to Germany's Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, Germany exported over 700,000 tons of waste to Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. There's a good chance some of that waste ended up in the Citarum. Some pundits insist that a global treaty to reduce plastic pollution is the only way to save the Citarum. Indonesian activist Daru Setirini put it succinctly when she said, "The Citarum cannot be saved by cleaning measures alone. If we won't tackle the root causes and regulate industries, educate the population, and switch to sustainable waste management, the Citarum will continue to be in trouble." End quote. Today, Indonesia is one of the world's largest textile manufacturers, but this achievement has come at a high price for the environment. The Citarum isn't the only polluted river in West Java. Others, such as the Citarum River, are also contaminated, just to a lesser degree. There is no question that cleaning the Citarum will have a major impact on the lives of millions of people. According to the World Bank, it could add up to $280 million to Indonesia's economy annually. With climate change becoming more severe, it's more important than ever to clean the Citarum to reduce heavy flooding during the rainy season. A clean Citarum will also be a vital source of water during droughts. The UN predicts that up to 5 billion people could face water shortages by 2050. While the struggle to revive the Citarum may seem like it doesn't affect you, it actually does. Indonesia is currently the second largest contributor of plastic pollution in the ocean after China. And as you probably know, ocean pollution is a major global crisis that's affecting everything from marine life to our climate. Saving the Citarum will take many years and require significant effort. Still, it's a challenge Indonesia must take on, not just for its own future, but the future of the entire planet. Water is essential for life on Earth, but it's one of the most threatened resources. During the 10th Water Forum in Bali in 2024, President Widodo captured this sentiment perfectly when he said, "Without water, there is no food, no peace, no life. No water, no life, no growth." Indonesia's not alone in the battle against pollution. Many other countries are engaged in a similar fight. The Citarum is just one of thousands of rivers worldwide that are heavily polluted. In many ways, the battle to save the Citarum, it's a battle to save humanity and protect the environment. And it's a fight that I genuinely hope we win for the sake of future generations. Thank you for watching.